Hi, I'm Terry, one of the Consumer Technology Specialists for Mid-Continent Public Library. And have you ever wondered how to center a title across a page, or maybe you'd like to double space instead of single space, or maybe even add more space between two paragraphs? Well, we're going to look at that and a lot more today by looking at the paragraph group on the ribbon in Word. The paragraph group in Word can be found on the Home tab of the ribbon. It's a very diverse group, but every button will affect the formatting of your document. It is so diverse, in fact, that we are going to create a series of videos so that we can look at a lot of these buttons in a little more detail. In the upper left of that paragraph group, you'll see that there are 3 buttons that are somewhat related. They have something to do with creating lists. So we have bullets, we have numbers, and then we have multi-level lists that would be used for outlines. The next group of buttons on the right both have something to do with indenting text. One is to decrease the indent, and the other one is to increase the indent. In the lower left of the paragraph group, we have 4 related buttons that all have to do with horizontal alignment, and they are left align, center, right align, and justify. The line and paragraph spacing button has multiple options that you will want to explore. It not only defines the line spacing, but it also helps you determine the spacing between the different paragraphs. On the far right, you'll find 3 very interesting buttons in that we usually associate those buttons with tables and how we format them. Starting at the bottom left, we have shading, we have borders to the right of that, and above borders we have sort. So while we use these definitely with tables, we can also use, especially the bottom 2 buttons, with just plain text as well. In the upper right, you have a button that looks sort of like a paragraph mark. That is called the Show Hide button. For people who use Word all the time, this Show Hide button is very, very important because it shows hidden code that helps with troubleshooting or with advanced features in Word. In the far lower right is a dialog box launcher that looks like a little arrow pointing down and to the right. Now it opens up its own dialog box, and while some of those features are the same as what we see on the ribbon, there are other features that are just as important, maybe even more important, depending on the type of document that you are creating. And so we will also examine the dialog box launcher in a future video. Let's look at the left margin of our document here for our first example. And as you look at that left margin, you can see that it is really straight. All of the letters line up exactly on that left margin. But if you look at the right margin, that isn't nearly as straight as the left margin. Now this is called left alignment, and I can even tell that it's defaulted as a left align because when I go to that paragraph group on the ribbon, I can see that that very first button in the lower left has a gray background behind it that says that this is indeed left aligned. Now, left alignment is what you will do most of the time, but occasionally you'll want to use some of these other buttons. So as we look at our paragraph group and the second button, it's center. So if I want to center something, maybe I want to center my title, I can click in that title. I don't need to select all the text and then click the center button. And now I have centered text. Now the only thing about centering is sometimes people get a little crazy with centering. And let me show you kind of what happens here. Because even though it's great for signs and posters, This is just sort of too much. And you always want to be careful that, for the most part, text is left aligned, and only for a special emphasis would you center. So signs and posters, great. Documents, be really careful with that centering. So in fact, I'm going to go back and move everything. That half line is just not right. This one doesn't really make sense either. And move everything back to that left align. But on occasion, centering is great. Now, used even less is the right align, which is the third button here. And you might decide that you want to have a straight right margin. So let me click in my text and then click on that button. And so now we have a very straight right margin, but we also then have a half a line that kind of starts in the middle of the line and then goes to the right. For a special effect, that might work okay, but probably not for this paragraph. You might have a column of numbers that are lined up on the right margin, and you want to have a little bit of text above that column, and so you might want to right align it. Or it used to be that when you wrote letters, the date was always supposed to be right aligned. So there are some specific reasons for using right align, but we're going to go back to left align for this particular paragraph. The last button here is justify. And justify is something that is used quite often with newspapers and magazines, even books, because that makes sure that you have a straight left margin and a straight right margin when possible. So let's click in that paragraph and justify. Now what justify does is it spreads the letters out, it adds a little bit more space between the different words so that you can have that straight left and right margin. When it first came out and newspapers first started using it, I remember hearing a lot of grumbling because you'd see a word at the left margin, a lot of space, and then a word at the right margin. Fortunately, justify has improved a lot, and anymore there are professional environments where justify is the expected sort of default for any kind of document. As we look at our paragraphs here, we can see that the line spacing is not truly single-spaced, even though this is the default. With older versions of Word, we really had a true single spacing, and somewhere along the way that has changed so that Word emulates desktop publishing somewhat with that extra little bit of space between the lines. So how do you get a true single spacing if that's what you need? Well, first we'll just click in our paragraph, and then we're going to go to the right of the horizontal alignment buttons to this line and paragraph spacing button. And then to the right side of that button, we have a drop down, and we'll click it. And sure enough, we can see that yes, there's just a little bit of extra space here between the lines at 1.15, which is our default. Now, if I hover my mouse over the 1.0, you can see that it pulls in a little bit, and it is the true single spacing. Now, as I go down and hover over the different sizings here, here is space and a half, I guess. So it's single spacing plus another half of a line. Here's double spacing. Here's 2.5. And watch that. There is your triple spacing that people sometimes use for writing comments between their different lines. So that can be a really nice tool, but let's go to single spacing. And yes, there's definitely a difference here between the first paragraph now and the second paragraph when you look at that line spacing. Well, there's something else that we can do. What happens if we decide that we would like to add or remove some of the space between the two paragraphs? Well, did somebody press enter here at the end of this paragraph and then again between the paragraphs? Well, let's check that out. And the way we do that is we go to the upper right of the paragraph group to the Show Hide button. Now, if you're not familiar with show hide, there is a little dot that shows every time you press the space bar. So between every word here, we have a space and a little dot. At the end of each paragraph, in other words, where you've pressed enter as you typed, there is a paragraph mark. So here there's a paragraph mark at the end of the paragraph, and then there's nothing that shows that there's an extra blank line in here, and then there's another paragraph mark at the end of this paragraph. Well, how did we get that extra space then? Well, I'm going to just click and drag over the paragraph mark, although I really could click and drag over, say, the last word or so. And you can see now that while I'm selecting the word and the paragraph mark, there's also extra space added to that line. So in Word, you're able to add extra space either above or below a line, in this case, below. So we can remove it by going to that line and paragraph spacing button, click the drop down, and here we can remove the space after the paragraph, which is just the very last choice. So we'll click that. And now, as we look at the first paragraph and the second paragraph, we can see that they are equally distant, that there's no extra line there. Well, what if we have this very much compressed look, and we decide that we would like to add space between these two paragraphs? Well, we could come down to the second paragraph, for example, and go back to that line and paragraph spacing button, click the drop down, but then let's go to add spacing before paragraph, click that, and now when I just select text and the top part of that line, see how we have that extra gray space that again is giving us the spacing that we would like to have between our first two paragraphs. While we still have our show hide button on, let's look at one more way that you might want to influence your line spacing. Now generally, if you decide, for example, that this last sentence should be on its own separate line, you would click in front of that first word of the sentence and then press enter. Now what that gives you is called a hard return. And you'll notice that now we have more white space between this sentence and then the lines above it. But what if I want this sentence that I've just moved into its own line to still have the same formatting, the same line spacing as the paragraph above? Well, let's press backspace to get back into that paragraph. What we can do instead of a hard return is a soft return. And the way we do that is we press Shift Enter. Now this brings up a new symbol that you may see. It's kind of a backwards curving arrow. And then notice how this sentence, even though it's on its own line, has the same line spacing as the paragraph above. And formatically, it is still considered part of this paragraph. Any changes that I make here will also be reflected here. Before we look at the next couple of buttons, let's first remove the show hide symbols that we see. So to do that, we would go back up to the show hide button, and we can tell that it's turned on because it has this light gray background. And all we need to do is click on it to turn it off, and then the dots for spaces and the paragraph marks for where we've pressed enter go back as hidden code. Now, let's say that as we look at this first paragraph, the last sentence is, "Why was this such an adventure?" And then below that, we can see text that explains why we had such an adventure. So really, we have a list here. And we might decide that instead of starting each of these sentences with almost GPS, I-44 sometimes, maybe we decide that we would like for this list to be alphabetical. Well, we can do that even though this is just text and not a table. All we need to do is select the text and then go up to the Sort button, which is just to the left of the Show Hide button, and we click. Now when we do that, we get a dialog box that's named Sort Text. And it even intuits that we are going to sort by paragraphs, but the drop down here is headings, so we could sort by headings as well. To the right of that, we have three important choices that we need to decide on, and it's picked that we have text, but if I click the drop down, we might need to sort by number or by date instead, and that could be a really important choice. So always be sure to look at this list and make the best selection possible. To the right of that, we are going to sort ascending, but we could sort descending as well. Notice that we have three kinds of text that we could sort by if we had that kind of a document. We don't, but just know that you can sort three different levels if you need to do that. Below, on the left-hand side, you have a really important item that sometimes gets lost, and that is my list has a header row or it doesn't have a header row. If we had a header row, we would want to be sure to select that, because if we said no header row and we had one, that header row would sort in the midst of our list, and then we wouldn't have a header. So always be careful to make the correct choice here. Well, we don't have a header row. We'll click OK. And now as we look at this list, we have almost, GPS, I-44, sometimes we. Very easy to sort even though we didn't have a table. Now we can also come up to our title because I think it doesn't stand out quite enough, and what we could do is come up to our shading button and go to the right where it has a drop down, and then we could choose from theme colors, standard colors, even more colors, so you get kind of a palette of colors. Or if you have colored shading already and you want to turn that off, you could just say no color. But let's go with a light blue, and that easy. We have that light blue shading, but notice it doesn't shade just the words, it shades the entire paragraph, which is this very first line. Now I might decide that doesn't stand out quite enough, so I could go to the right of that paint pail and shading and find the button that has 4 boxes. It's the borders button, and when we click the drop down, you'll notice that this looks very similar to even what is in Excel. So we could have a bottom, top, left, right border. We could turn off borders if we have them. In this case, we just have one line, but all borders means that top, bottom, left, right are all selected, or outside borders in this case we get is the same thing. We could also, if we come down to borders and shading at the very bottom, even create more choices by saying, okay, well, I want this style of line. Here's the color that I would like, although I'll probably go with black. Maybe we'll go with a really dark blue. And then for the width, it says a 1/2 point, but maybe we could go with, oh, let's say 2 1/4 point instead. Now, because I've clicked to where I have this dialog box, then I also need to come over to the preview and click where I want those borders to be. So top, right, bottom, left, and then I'll click OK. And now I have this lovely background with a border. And at that point, I might decide that, you know what, this looks great. I think I'm going to make it larger though. Maybe that's too large. And I could even make my text bold. People use this kind of idea quite a bit when they create newsletters or if they have different sections within their document. This just helps special text stand out. This is looking really good, but there is one more thing that I would like to do, and that is to make the list of items that we have alphabetized a little more visually distinctive. Now to do that, I'd like to move the text over and indent maybe about a ½ inch or so. Well, if I'm going to move something over a ½ inch, my first thought is, well, maybe I should use tab. Well, let's try that. If we press tab, the first line moves over a ½ inch. That's great, but it doesn't affect the second line. Well, let's try another line here, another paragraph that has more than one line. And if we press tab, no, it only moves the first line over, but not the second. Well, let's undo. And this time, let's use some buttons on the ribbon that move any of the lines over, the entire paragraph over. And that is, when we go to the paragraph group, the, first of all, decrease indent, and then to the right of that, the increase indent. So when I increase the indent, I click. Oh, now it has moved over both the top line and the second line of that paragraph. Well, let's in fact select all of the text here and increase the indent. And again, on this second example where we have more than one line, everything moves over to the right about a ½ inch. Now, if for some reason I decide that I don't want to do that, after all, what I can do is use the opposite button, the decrease indent. And when I click it, it moves everything back to the left. So I'm going to select the rest of these and click the decrease indent to get everything back to where it originally was. To learn even more, be sure to go to mymcpl.org/online learning, where you will find our great online resources, which include Universal Class, lynda.com, and Learning Express Library. Be sure to join us each week as we present a variety of tech topics. Each week we premiere 3 new videos. You'll be able to find them at 1 o'clock on Wednesday and Friday, or at 2 o'clock on Tuesday. You can find us on Facebook at MCPL 360, or if you prefer, be sure to subscribe to our MCPL MO channel on YouTube, where you'll be able to find our MCPL Consumer Technology Resources playlist.